Hi, I'm Erik Braeden Lewis, a PhD candidate at Florida State University.
I'm Dominic Bellenger from the University of Cambridge, where I'm a senior research associate at the Von Hugel Institute.
I'm Zachary Stolzfus. I'm a doctoral candidate in history at Florida State University.
And I'm Patrick Harris. I'm a PhD candidate in history at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. I'll go ahead and get us started off on the discussion this morning. I was struck by something in Dominic's presentation where he mentioned that the historiography of the reception of emigres has tended to emphasize the positive aspects of their reception. One thing that he wanted to look at in his own paper was some of the more negative reactions to the reception of emigre in host countries, and that's something that we can talk a little bit about that touches on. Well, I would say all of our papers. It's a little bit different for Zachary's because he's focused on what the emigres left behind, rather than so much on the reception. But I think this particular, broad generality, looking at more positive forms of reception of exiles as opposed to negative ones, is something that plays an interesting role in the historiography, and I think maybe can also apply to immigrant policies back in France itself. So I just wanted to start with that. Again, it's a very broad topic, but I think it's can be something useful to organize our thoughts when we think about how immigrants navigated their predicament.
Well, can I say something in reply to that?
Yeah, sure.
I think that when the emigres first arrived in Great Britain in particular, the first reaction would have been of shock because of the great numbers. But I think very soon the administration, the Pitt's administration, and various charitable groups seized an opportunity for propaganda, saying these are examples of what happens if a revolution takes place. Look at these poor devils, we'll be there next. And I think that is where, in the most simple terms, where the positive reception came from. But what I was sort of arguing in my short paper this time was that as soon as that initial great welcome was exhausted and they became more of a problem than living examples of anti-revolution, the situation changed, and everybody really wanted to get rid of them, and they couldn't. And that's really how I see reception. But at the beginning, I think, from Britain, perhaps uniquely, of the countries where they arrived, there was a very positive response from both the state and from the established Church of England.
Just as a follow-up question for that, do you see the immigrants as a problem? Do you think of that primarily as a administrative and economic problem, which you talk about at some length in your paper, or more so than sort of political fears of revolutionary, infiltration of the immigrant community?
I think I see it more as an administrative problem, because what was unique about the emigration in Britain was the predominance of clergy and Roman Catholic priests and bishops, and they were, on the whole, pretty well towing the line as far as political attitudes were concerned. So that was less of a problem. But what was a real problem was the great numbers of them, and the fact that because they were clergy and so on, they couldn't really think of anything for them to do, so they were just hanging around. But I don't think there was a concern about infiltration of revolutionary ideas. Anyway, as I suggested early on in my short communication, the Alien Office was soon set up, and that did create a quite effective means of surveillance, which was also assisted by the fact that the clergy had, in the person of the Bishop of Saint-Paul-de-Léon, Monseigneur Jean-François de la Marche, an effective administrator of their opinions. If they diverged from the official line, they were in trouble. More complicated was much later on, when Bonaparte comes into the scene, when the whole of the Gallican ideal of the church and all the rest of it, which they'd supported, was put into question.
I guess, sorry, go ahead. No, please go ahead.
My paper was about Dubarry, but my dissertation is actually about emigres on the Franco-Spanish border. And it seems to me what you've described is the exact opposite situation of what I'm seeing. Because the clergy were able to find jobs in the border region, it was less of a shock in that. And I think they weren't even bothered by the number that came across either, because on the border, most of these people had been fluidly back across the mountains without any real consciousness of which side of the border they were on. And so these are people that the families that I'm following, they knew each other, they were related. It wasn't as big of a deal religiously or personally. It was really, I think, the state worried about French expansionism more than anything. And the state picks these little cases to blow it up, but it's a little bit different than what you've described in Great Britain.
Yeah, that's the impression I got, was that Great Britain was unique in that sense. I mean, the difficulties with the emigres, including the clergy, in continental Europe was really the expansion of the French Republic and Napoleonic empires, which, as you say, so I would agree with you entirely on that. Obviously, there were no jobs available in England for these people other than teaching English, teaching French to English people. And there was a limit to how many people in England wanted to learn French.
Dominic, you had mentioned the possibility of sending some of the emigre, was it the priests or the prisoners of war, to Ireland and Australia, and other ideas that were put forward. And in those cases, that was just to kind of get them out of the metropole, where their ideas were seen as potentially dangerous? Or what was some of the rationale behind?
Well, I think that the rationale, Australia was never a going idea. I just mentioned that in passing.
Yeah.
Ireland, some did go to Ireland, and I think the idea there was that because of their sound ideas on the relationship between the church and the state, they might give an example to the clergy there. And also because during this period was the foundation of the Royal College of St. Patrick, which was a national college for the training of clergy. And in fact, nearly all the foundation staff there were French clergy. So I was thinking more in those terms. The emigre lay people, I think, were a real problem, because I don't think that the British government was at all keen on sending them anywhere, because they just didn't know what their ideas would be, as well as their the fact of their existence. But I'm speaking specifically about the clergy when I talk about those possibilities. Canada was was the only real place where they might have gone, but even there, because of the extraordinarily volatile situation in Canada related to the British takeover, the possible clashes between native-born French Canadians and emigre French people, it was very complicated. Although, as I think I suggested, about 50 went there. But these are small numbers when one's talking about thousands. Yeah. So re-emigration, as it were, to another part of the British colonial empire was not on the whole a strong possibility, Canada having been excluded. And Ireland, of course, itself was suffering from its own internal difficulties during the 1790s.
I don't know whether this has come up in your research, but I don't think I mentioned it in my own talk, but there were at least a few hundred immigrant clergy who were shuttled off to the West Indies during the British occupation there to take up vacant positions in Saint-Domingue and some of those other colonies.
I have come across those because I've been recently writing a chapter on a new history of British Catholicism, and I'm doing the colonial chapter, so I have come across those. And I suppose numerically they were probably about the same number as went to Canada. But staying in one particular part of the Caribbean for a long period of time, I think was quite difficult given the comings and goings of who actually was in charge at a particular time. Mm-hmm. But I was aware of them, and I have been looking at them. But in this short paper, I didn't want to confuse matters. I think I would have had to have a whole paragraph explaining away why they weren't there for too long.
Yeah, I see some of the same issues with the administrative burden of emigre in my own paper, which is part of why in the Caribbean case, they are being shuttled around from place to place, and often people don't want them and are trying to make them someone else's problem. With some of these different colonies, both British colonies and occupied French colonies being closer together, there are different jurisdictions that are able to compete about, who has to take care of the French emigre. And one thing that Dominic said earlier that stuck out to me is that they were used as a political example of what could happen if the revolution is allowed to take hold. And this is definitely true in the Caribbean, with the additional layer of concern over the overturning of the slave system, right? It's not just the French revolutionaries, but the slave revolutionaries in Saint-Domingue. So in that sense, they're received positively as, not just as fellow counter-revolutionaries, but as, fellow white elites who are threatened by the revolution in Saint-Domingue. But at the same time, there is a lot of dissatisfaction with their presence, both because of the administrative problems and because, especially in the Caribbean case, perhaps more so than would have been the case with the Caribbean clergy, there's a sense that they're not necessarily politically reliable, that their loyalties can't be trusted. This is a pretty consistent thread that, as I talked about in my paper, it's a consistent thread that runs through the policy of both British and French responses to exiles in the Caribbean, that they need to be politically vetted, and that on the one hand, there is a need to receive and assist exiles who are politically reliable, but they don't always know who those are. And perhaps that might be more applicable to some of the continental cases, I'm not sure. But in any case, I guess we can move on from that to anything people want to discuss. I did want to come back to Zachary, though, since he's not working on reception of immigrants, but on immigrant policies in France itself. I don't know if you want to start there from something that's of interest to you, or if you have anything in mind.
Well, I should just say, I should preface this by saying that emigre policies and the ongoing problems that are associated with emigres, that is not my area of specialization. Rather, I'm doing my dissertation research on changing on hypothèque and changing laws surrounding credit from the old regime through the revolution. So I stumbled upon this rather accidentally just through that research. But one thing that has really struck me is one common element among all of our papers is exactly what you touched on, Patrick, which was the administrative problems that are posed by emigre, whether for the state, for the land that they've left behind, such as France, or the land that they emigrate to, such as England. They create a host of different issues, and I guess that's what kind of binds all of our papers together. And by thinking about it from the perspective of the country that they leave behind, France. So there are so many changing policies that are happening as different governments succeed one another. And of course, the convention declares them to be legally dead, and spouses are becoming legally divorced just on the grounds of the husband having emigrated and the wife having stayed behind. So there's all kinds of different interesting and problematic legal problems posed by immigration. But in respect to hypothèque, it is almost as though this is one of the few constants. So the legal status of emigre is changing throughout the revolution. But their land that they leave behind is treated in many respects as almost a constant by the state. And one of the reasons for that is, of course, the great importance attached to land historically in France, going back well into the old regime through the revolution. It changes as property itself changes in its definition and how it's used. But land itself is seen by the state, of course, as something whose the validity of property rights, the validity of the land is supposed to be respected. It's sacrosanct. It's a part of, property rights are not very clearly defined in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, but nevertheless in Article 17, there is this strong language used to describe the importance of property rights for all French citizens, including, you know, those who have left France while they've relinquished those property rights, or they've relinquished control over the property. Now that the property has passed to the state, the property rights of creditors have not been negated. And so for me, this is one of the interesting aspects of the émigré experience, if you will, is not just the things that are disrupted by emigration, but rather also the things that the state latches onto as a constant or as a kind of unchanging principle, if you will. And so for me, with this paper, Ipotec kind of provided that, at least for the state.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point you touch on, that exile is not just a condition of an absolute rupture. There are things left behind, there are continuities, there are interactions that continue both inside and outside France as a result of the exile. That's something that I think would touch on Mr. Lewis's paper as well, right? I mean, in his case, because the journeys are actually, you know, multiple and continuing, so that may be a little bit unusual compared to some immigrant experiences. But in many cases, there's not just a definitive rupture, and then everything that you need to know about the exiles continues outside of France.
I think that's an excellent point. First, she is abnormal, and that has to be, you know, stated from the beginning that this isn't how most émigrés function. And this link between émigrés and credit and the state really directing money it comes up in every letter that she writes back to the state. She's like, you have to let me go to London. All of my jewelry is the sole form of my credit. I owe all of these creditors this money. I still owe the state money for certain things. And she's like, no, nobody will get this money if I don't get these jewels back. Despite the fact that she had a chateau at Lucienne, she still had most of her possessions buried in the grounds there, hidden until the day before they executed her. But she, whether of her own or with the help of her lawyers, knew that she could use this, and the state would at least somewhat buy this as an excuse to let her go get her jewelry back. And Zach and I were talking about that yesterday or a couple of days ago when I read his paper, that in every instance that I've seen with Dubarry, and even with the few cases I've seen on the Spanish border, this need for this legitimacy of money and the money trail trumps many other, if not most other, ideas of the revolution, particularly the family unit. I think mostly, but it's something I see. It's extremely important inside or outside of the state.
Well, when I was watching all of the papers, it did occur to me in different contexts. I should just say, Erik, the jewels that she's trying to take out of France, it seems like this is really fraught with problems for the revolutionary government, because if she takes them out of France, she could use them to obtain credit in England, perhaps, with those same. So in other words, it's denying a French creditor a property claim in favor of taking collateral out of France to use it within England. So I guess what I'm saying is an important element of this that I did not touch on really in my paper is that one of the reasons the French state is doing this is because it wants to validate the claims of creditors within France as well, who are often portrayed in some of the literature as, you know, hardworking artisans, members of the laboring class, this being during the convention, you know, who are entitled to being repaid by their delinquent profligate debtors who have now fled the country. So the state kind of sets itself up as this moral institution that's going to make sure that these creditors are repaid. And her act of taking these jewels out of France is in many ways, you know, a kind of revolutionary act, because in essence it's saying, I'm going to take this collateral elsewhere and use it outside of France, where, you know, I'll get loans in London or wherever. But in any case, I digress just to say that there are common themes that that I think are economic, that kind of come to the fore in all of these papers in some ways, in the sense that the state is being forced to make these types of decisions, in part because of the problems that emigres pose. But I'm really curious, Dominic, the English state obviously sees it initially as kind of an ideological tool. The emigres themselves are there to help prove the point that revolution is dangerous and can undermine the very building blocks of society, if you will. But then they become a burden. And I guess my question would be, you seem to say that happens under Bonaparte, but when does that transition really occur, where they shift from being, is it, and you may have mentioned this, and I apologize if I've missed it, but does it occur after just a few months, or is it more of a gradual transition?
I think it happens pretty rapidly, within a year or so. If you think about 1792 to 93 as the years in which most of the émigrés arrived in England, by the end of 1793 or 1794, it was already being seen as a problem. And I think in part, one has to remember that the British state was very undeveloped in terms of taxation and many other forms. And increasingly, more and more money had to be spent on the army, the navy, and also the provision for vast numbers of French prisoners of war who numerically surpassed those of the royalist émigrés. So I think that the burden became pretty obvious, and the idea of it being an ideological tool, it was too expensive an ideological tool for any state, but especially a state as undeveloped as the British state was at this moment in time. And so I think the answer is very early on. I only mentioned Bonaparte in the context of the clergy, who were very much seeing themselves as the exiled Church of France ready to go back. Napoleon comes along and destroys that possibility by the Concordat, because all the bishops are called to resign and all the parishes are redrawn. So there was no possibility then of going back. And those who remained in Britain after 1801 tend to be the more extreme elements of Gallicans anyway. So in answer to your question, sorry I've gone on a bit there, I'd say pretty early on. Mm-hmm. Started off fantastically welcome, then how can we make them welcome, and then let's get rid of them. And I think that happened within 18 months to 2 years. So it's pretty quick. Incidentally, vis-a-vis what you're talking about, debt and so on, I think anecdotally, one or two of the leading émigrés in England were regarded as feeling rather relieved that they'd escaped debt in France. So perhaps their desire to return wasn't so great.
Yeah,
go ahead.
No. I was just going to say that is an irony there, in the sense that émigrés whose lands were confiscated by the state, now their debts were the state's problem. So it was nice in that respect, yeah.
Yes, that sounds to me to be something that they would have laughed about if they had cause for laughter.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, the role of credit and debt in the Caribbean and the British intervention there, I think I touched on a little bit, is also interesting, because it's another case where you have people escaping debt, not necessarily by going into exile, but when the British invade Martinique and Saint-Domingue and other locations, they tend to suspend the debts of the French planters there, which was part of the reason they were looking for a British intervention in the first place, was to get away from their French creditors. Yeah. And at the same time, a lot of the exiles who are in London, who have connections to the Caribbean, whether whether they're from there or they just own property there, they're able to leverage that property to obtain credit from British and other European lenders. And in fact, the exiles from the Caribbean tend to live quite well compared to other émigrés, because they are able to essentially mortgage their plantations. Sometimes plantations that they don't even currently have, but the thinking is hypothetically the success of the British intervention will make sure that their creditors will eventually be paid, because the plantations will be producing. And I'd be interested to know, incidentally, about how the hypothèque and other, constructions in French debt law played out in a colonial context. I'm not informed enough about that, but you do have some of the same case where being in exile, or at least being outside the space of Republican France, is not necessarily a net negative in terms of the economic interests of individuals.
Yeah, what's curious about that, Patrick, to me is how, like, as soon as these islands are taken over by the British Empire, it's almost as though they, or would you say it's fair to say that they kind of receive almost like a new lease on their economic kind of potential, or in the sense that the colonies, Saint-Domingue and others, for French creditors were a perennial source of real problems. The planters there, they leveraged their land and even more so their slaves as collateral for loans from French creditors based in the metropole. And, there were certain allowances made, certain repayment schedules where, the planters could make their payments over longer periods of time. Instead of maybe a yearly payment, it might be a bi-yearly payment to account for the fact that, there's a great distance involved. But they were really a poor investment. They mismanaged their resources. They were late on almost, many of them were late on their payments, and a lot of creditors lost money, at least in the pre-revolutionary colonial context. It was a source of constant complaints, and then the debtors would be convicted in absentia by a court in the metropole, but that meant nothing to them. There was no one there to enforce anything in the colonies. So they just kind of continue to mismanage their resources and obtain loans from different creditors, over leveraging their assets and getting deeper and deeper into debt, which I would be really curious if that may have played, it sounds like it may have played a role in the fact that the planter class was so welcoming to the British.
Absolutely. I mean, that did play a role in motivating the British intervention. The thought that they could free themselves from their French creditors. I remember reading one of the documents. One of the planters resident in Saint-Domingue was writing to the British War Office and talking about how debt should be restructured, and he said something like that the planters were the true citizens of the colonies, and they were being exploited by cosmopolitans, was the word he used, the French lenders. So that definitely was a cleavage in colonial politics. And you're right, that it was actually very difficult for the debtors to enforce their claims before the revolution. So it's not as if they were actually being forced to pay up that often. And that they had a kind of aristocratic insouciance about having to repay their debts. I think that was even sort of part of their self-image as a class. But that definitely did motivate the British intervention, and of course they very promptly became in debt to British creditors, and ironically, who had somewhat better legal mechanisms for trying to collect on debt. Although the British creditors ended up, at least those involved in Saint-Domingue, ended up losing all of their money because the British evacuated the island, and it was taken over by the revolutionaries. But.
Well, I mean, when Dubarry went to London, it was exactly like Zach expected. She used her diamonds and leveraged them for credit in the British state, but the state was a little more effective in her case than in the islands. After she died, all of her jewels were locked up in the bank when she was there so that she could run credit. It launched a legal battle between the French state, the British state, and the descendants of Dubarry via her sister-in-law that didn't get settled until 1898 when Christie's auctioned off her jewelry to pay back the British state. So they recovered their money then at a huge increase, honestly. But that might have been a good case that doesn't seem normal in the rest of the context.
That's interesting that it went that late. I know some of the compensation claims for Saint-Domingue emigres were still being litigated about that late in the 19th century. So that's one thing about debt in particular, is that it tends to dilate time. You always find surprising cases of these claims going forward decades and decades after everyone originally involved was dead.
Yeah, speaking about, thinking about clergy, emigres from France who were members of the clergy, I discovered in some of the documents I was looking through, revolutionaries had taken a careful accounting of all of the debts, or rather all of the loans that some of the abbeys in Rennes and Bas-Rennes had lent out to various aristocrats or princes within the Holy Roman Empire. And so these loans predated the acquisition of Alsace by France. These were loans that had been made in the 16th century and 17th century before, I think, 17, so it would have been 1681 Alsace. So before 1681, and the revolutionaries made careful note of how much was owed. And I don't know what happened to that money, if perhaps the reason that they made note of this was in case, in the future, they could foresee the event that some of these Austrian princes might be defeated in battle, and then in the peace negotiations could be confronted with these with this money that was now owed to the French state, since the French state had confiscated all of the property of the church, including, presumably, I like I said, I didn't look into this in much detail, but presumably these debts that were owed to the abbey. So I don't know if the impression I get, Dominic, among the clergy who are in England and elsewhere is they're very much in limbo, in the sense they don't know what their future holds. But looking at some of the documents, do they start to kind of I don't know how to phrase this exactly, but do they start to plan for their future? Do they start to have any kind of hopes or aspirations for settling back in France, or is it just kind of like they're just waiting to see what happens to them?
Well, they have the bishops in London, 20, 30 of them at any one time. They vary a bit in numbers. Did have meetings throughout the 1790s to discuss the future. But for them, the future was always the past, because everything they had depended on their landed status, really, in France. And any idea of going back always seemed to predicate a complete return to the Ancien Regime. And I think they were unable, in general terms, to see a way forward. That's the great majority, 75% of the bishops. 25% had an eye for the main chance. They saw that the church in France was never going to be the same again, and they realized there was a future if it could be negotiated. So, but the great majority, I think, were definitely living in a self-imposed limbo.
I'd say,
and saw no way forward at all. The same couldn't be said of a great number of the lower clergy, who probably wanted to go back and would have gone back if their status as deported or as emigres or whatever had changed. And I think that the great majority of those who were still alive by the end of the 1790s did return.
Yeah. You pick up on the point I was going to make. For the lower people, they really wanted to either get back, and I would say that was the majority. And those that didn't want to go back were those that found a job and some sort of church function in Spain, which again was much easier than Great Britain. So that was my only interjection there.
Right.
Well, I believe we've got the notification that it's almost time to wrap up. Is there anything we want to address before that?
Did we want to talk maybe briefly about the fifth paper about the Netherlands and
yeah, we should definitely do that. It definitely overlaps with some of these concerns with economics during in his case, more the Napoleonic era, but I think there are some connections that can be made there, if anyone has any thoughts.
I thought it was a really interesting paper in the sense that Napoleon just kind of inherited this situation. He wasn't able to press nearly as much as in other peace treaties for extracting as much as possible from the Netherlands. But I the whole time I was reading or listening to the paper, I just couldn't help but think, in some ways, they were fulfilling all the dreams of Louis XIV and his wars with the Netherlands, of just like, acquiring these this total control over these markets, and just realizing all this this boon in commerce and so forth. So I'm sorry he wasn't here today, because the questions I had were more I guess specific about French approaches to the local economy of the Netherlands, or for like you might say how they used the continental system to perhaps exploit the Netherlands and so forth. But no, just to say I enjoyed all of the papers, I should say, but in any case.
Yeah, they were nice. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We're going to let him shut it down now.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you guys.
Thanks, gentlemen.
Bye.
Bye-bye.